Can you guys hear me? Is that on? Okay. Okay. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to the Departments of Architecture, Landscape Architecture and Planning. I really love when there's that interdisciplinary work because sometimes you don't see that cross-fertilization in design. And I'm so excited to see all of you here to learn. Tonight I'm going to speak about the interrelationship between vulnerability and the built environment. And I'll explore some lessons learned from my time working for the City of New York and how it relates to global climate responses and what we as designers can try and do to be impactful as we try and face climate change. For me, I think resiliency is a really important issue to talk about because it's a way to really integrate our understanding of the built environment, the natural environment, and human needs. And what's most important to me and what I hope you'll take away is really thinking about how to integrate that human element into all of your design work. So this is a house. It's on Staten Island, and it was swept off its foundation by the force of Hurricane Sandy. Although it's located in the nation's largest city, what you see gives you a sense of isolation, that this is just one house and maybe one family fighting nature. And I'm showing this nature because I think it's pretty provocative and it represents a lot of the framing when we read about climate change or hear about climate change and we hear about people who are affected by climate change. In particular, sea level rise, because it really looks at this as just an issue of them versus the environment and not all of us in relation to each other and a changing ecology. And I think it is important to sort of just ground this discussion of a changing environment in data. And on the chart is the International Panel on Climate Change, global mean temperature over the last 170 years. Global temperature is increasing. This seems to track very closely with carbon emissions. And carbon emissions result they result naturally, but they're also a result of human behavior, our own breath to begin with. But our waste, our buildings, and our mobility all emit significant amounts of CO2. And even if we became carbon neutral tomorrow, the effects of this increased presence of CO2 in the environment would continue to affect climate for the next several hundred, if not 1,000 years. So we can't just design based on what has happened in the past. We have to really look at this as a continually changing environment. And although I think it's really important to look at the root causes of CO2, and what we can do and how we can learn to do more with less by using renewable energy, finding significant efficiencies in how we feed and house ourselves. This is the subject of mitigation, which I'm really not going to focus on today, but there are lots of experts and I can talk to you afterwards if you're interested in learning more about mitigation. But I think this clinical understanding is really necessary so that we understand what the rise of global temperatures is doing to the built environment as it affects all of our lives. And one of the things to me that the ways we see climate change is this increase in natural disasters that have significantly increased over the last 30 years in almost by fourfold. And you see this across flood, drought, extreme temperature, and this is globally. So what can we do? There are usually really two camps of how do we deal with this changing environment. And one significant and vocal policy group is to talk about retreat, which is to move away from risks. And this is you hear this the most in relation to flood risk, but you also hear it around wildfires. And part of this looking at retreat is really focused on blaming victims. You should have known better. What did you think to live there? These places should be left to nature, which it's an understandable perspective, but it omits the why anyone ended up where they are, and why all of us are where we are, which is not just one individual choice, but a collective set of policies that have pushed people into places of physical vulnerability. And particularly when we look at housing and housing choice, that's a very significant component. So another option in relating to how do we deal with risk is to reinforce, and that's to use any kind of barrier, berm, levee to try and hold water back, or deal with whatever climate risk you're facing. And resiliency has popped up as this sort of like combination that's pretty undefined of like, how do we deal with risk? Well, we need to be more resilient. And it captures this mitigation work and some of adaptation, which are important parts of any solution. But for me, these physical efforts rarely capture the heart of our policies that have led to people being at the margins. So given that, I'm going to walk through some examples in New York City where we can do a little deeper dive on these root causes and sort of different ways we approach dealing with critical risk. So if you're not familiar with Hurricane Sandy, it happened in 2012 and affected the entire metropolitan region. Hurricane Sandy was an unusual storm. Usually hurricanes on the Atlantic form kind of close to the coast of Africa. They move they move west to the Caribbean, up the northeast coast, and then they follow the Gulf Stream to Europe. Hurricane Sandy made this leftward hook, which you see up there, which is very unusual, and went straight into the harbor. A significant part of New York City is in the floodplain. The red is showing you the areas flooded by Hurricane Sandy. New York City has 520 miles of coastline. Almost all of the coastline was affected. If you're not familiar with New York City, Manhattan is that up at the center. This is Brooklyn, Queens, it's the Rockaways, it's the Staten Island. And at the time of Hurricane Sandy, I was working as an urban planner and economic development consultant. And I was actually affected by Hurricane Sandy. The firm I was working for in Lower Manhattan closed temporarily because our building was unable to be serviced. The elevators didn't work. It was significantly damaged. So for 6 months, I was working remotely. And during that time, I really got to reflect on, like, how do I relate to what's happening in the built environment and what's happening to all these people. So in the days after Hurricane Sandy, which there was a significant power outage, which affected most of Manhattan, which is what most people see when they think of Hurricane Sandy. It caused $20 million in damages. It directly displaced over 70,000 people. The city received a lot of public assistance in both federal emergency management and then disaster recovery dollars from HUD, as well as money to assist public hospitals and housing. And so this is sort of what it looked like. There's a subway station flooded there, entrances to subway streets, and then lots of people were disrupted. So this is some housing, both a luxury condo building on what is your left, and public housing, and kind of every built condition. So this is the Rockaways looking at the boardwalk, which was entirely destroyed, as well as a significant amount of housing, which was damaged. And then there's bungalows, attached housing. And what's often lost, if you go to New York City today, like if you go to Manhattan, everything seems fine. And there's some people who complain about problems with the subway that hasn't been corrected, or large infrastructure projects that have been slow to complete. But on the whole, most upper class people, upper income people are doing fine. who's not doing fine and who doesn't have the set of resources to respond to a significant event are low-income people and people of color. And when they lose their home or they're disrupted, there's not enough resources for them. So thinking about people and their distress and their disruption, it's pretty frustrating to look at coverage that's really focused on climate change and climate risk and how we have to all move away from it. And this is our future. And the future is we just have to leave all this behind, but not talking about all the people and all the infrastructure and all of this effort and community that's all in one place. And also all of the policies that located about 50% of New York City's public housing in the floodplain. And significant challenges that make it difficult for people to get resources that they need. So although New York City had an incredible amount of volunteerism and resources, many people were still left behind. So to illustrate this, I'm going to walk through two very different examples. For my time at New York City Housing Preservation and Development, which is the nation's largest affordable housing development agency. And I'm going to talk about the challenges facing New York, particularly from a housing perspective. Some background on housing in New York. New York is in a state of housing emergency, which means it has a vacancy rate of any kind of housing of less than 2%. So that means if you're looking for housing, it's going to be really challenging for you to find a place to live. It also means housing is really expensive. So the lower your income, the harder it is for you to find a place to go. Over 60,000 people every night outside of Hurricane Sandy spend a night in a homeless shelter. And these are primarily working families, not people with single men with psychiatric disabilities, which is what people usually think when they think of homeless populations. Over 100 school-age children a year spend a night in a shelter. So in that context of housing emergency, every housing unit counts. So looking at an event like Hurricane Sandy, which spanned multiple mayoralities, there still is an urgency of looking at climate risk and looking at climate risk responsibly, recognizing we can't build the way we've built before, we can't continue in the pattern we've had before, but we also can't just move 800,000 people who live in the floodplain. There's no place for them. We have to look at what we can do to house the population we have while also deeply probing how we can find places for us all to live together. So I am going to tell you about a log cabin, which I promise you is in New York City. It is a resilient log cabin, meaning that it is elevated 12 feet with a steel helical pile foundation engineered in a way to withstand storm surge. And I'm showing it to you not because it represents design excellence, which I do not think it does, although it does represent some really creative engineering, but because it represents so many of the significant challenges in confronting risk in community design. And it also, for me, is pretty personal because my thoughts on this challenge really changed in working with this. So this house was located in Broad Channel, and it was owned by a woman, Sophia. And Broad Channel is on a spit of land that is between Queens and the Rockaways. It's an extremely vulnerable place. It has a series of man-made canals. It is for people who love living with water. It has a really interesting history. It is a former fishing colony that was a squatting community, which in the 1980s the city legalized by giving the homes to the former squatters. At this point in time, it's primarily white, working class, cops and firefighters, very tight-knit place. and it experienced incredible damage from Hurricane Sandy, and also is incredibly threatened by tidal flooding, where its streets experience inundation on like a king tide. So Sophia lived on this block, and after Hurricane Sandy, pretty much a week after the storm, was like, I'm going to rebuild, and I really want to live in a log cabin. So she called a modular log cabin company in South Carolina, and she ordered a modular log house based on like the rough size of her storm damaged house. And she didn't consult kind of anyone. I don't think she like talked to a relative or really ran this idea by anyone, certainly not an architect, engineer, an expediter, anyone familiar with anything relating to building code in New York City when she ordered these logs. And she gets her logs, and she finally is like, oh, I need a contractor to actually build this because they're not going to do this for me. And so she finds a contractor in 2013, so it's already been kind of a bit of time, and that contractor actually defrauded her and took all of her money. So she still had her logs, but she was out a few $100,000, all of her life savings. And so she turned to a program called Build It Back, which was the city's housing recovery program, and she felt designed for people like her, people who don't have the resources to rebuild their house and need some help. And Build It Back, which I worked on as the land use and zoning problem solver, took one look at her house and said, well, we can't do this because the logs you ordered don't meet any of our regulations at all. They don't meet zoning. You'll need a zoning variance, which is really complicated. They don't meet building code. You don't have a design that can be elevated. It's not fireproof. New York City has a pretty significant fire code that treats single-family homes like skyscrapers. So you have to have a sprinkler system. You have to have a lot of concrete. And so the solution for Sophia was like, if you find another contractor, we'll directly pay the contractor, but you have to manage this yourself. If you want the log cabin, that's fine. We're happy to make this work, but you have to drive this. And years went by. And Sophia wouldn't compromise on sort of the elements of her design that would need to fundamentally change to work. And also didn't really have the capability to work in this like pretty sophisticated context of, being your own general contractor in essence. So years passed, and we get to 2018. Build It Back has built, let me make sure you're looking at this so you know what happened. Build It Back has built over 8,000 homes for homeowners like Sophia, and we're down to the last 100 homes that haven't been built. And the mayor is like, why are these 100 homes not built? I want to go through them one by one and understand what's happening and how we can kind of get these people out of the program. And so we're going through, and almost every case has a pretty complicated story relating to like the streets being reconstructed, we didn't have access, or there was a fire. And then we get to Sophia, and pretty much everyone who worked in this program was like, we cannot deal with this log cabin anymore. And this person who won't listen to reason about building code. And the mayor said, well, actually, you need to have an equity mindset. You need to figure out how to meet Sophia where she's at, and figure out how to have a log cabin in New York City. And so we did. And this log cabin is a log cabin. It is on the outside. On the inside, it is concrete with then some vinyl siding to approximate a log cabin interior, but with fire safety measures and a sprinkler system. And it's elevated, which she didn't want, but she had to have. And I'm telling you this story not just because you probably otherwise wouldn't see a log cabin in New York City, because I think it illustrates like an important challenge facing designers and dealing with climate risk. Because there are two ways to look at this. One is, in a world of very limited resources, we wasted a lot to try and give one person a house. But on the other side, this is what it takes to maintain social and economic diversity in a large city. If we didn't rebuild Sophia's house, there's actually no place for Sophia to go be a working class homeowner in New York City. There aren't choices for her. And part of also what helped Sophia is she has this very tight-knit community which didn't feel that empathetic about the logs themselves, but kept advocating, to her representatives, to staff, like, you can't forget about Sophia. Sophia needs a house too. And while everyone else on the block got their rebuilt house and Sophia's lot was sitting empty, that was a really important reminder that although we may have a vision of what design should be, we have to listen to what people want and how they see their lives. The public invested a lot in keeping Broad Channel. That's a new street that has an interesting new architecture. It curves at the center rather than at a crown, so the water drains at the center, so it can sort of manage the street flooding a little better from tidal risk. So that is Sophia and Broad Channel. I'm going to move on to a more community scale to sort of illustrate a more significant challenge. So we're going to Edgemere, which is located in the Eastern Rockaways. Edgemere, or the Rockaways, are a really interesting place. It's east to west. The west side is white and upper income. The east side is low income, majority minority, 50 to 60% public housing, 45% home ownership, but low income homeowners. And looking at the Rockaways, which is low income, has most of a quarter of the public housing in Queens, people didn't just end up there. There are a set of social forces that put low income people in the Eastern Rockaways. In the 1950s and 60s, a significant urban planning force, Robert Moses, led New York City's urban renewal efforts, which led to significant amounts of slum clearance across the city, which in the Rockaways led both to the elimination of a significant amount of summer bungalows. The Rockaways hadn't been a year-round community before. And also the placement and relocation of actually households who lived in other parts of New York City were placed in bungalows, unwinterized bungalows, as their new temporary housing while they were supposed to wait for new public housing to be built, some of which was built and some of which was not. So in Edgemere, we have this public housing that was built through the slum clearance. We also have generational families that inherited housing after being relocated as part of the slum clearance, as well as new people who have moved there. And in this context, Edgemere hasn't received a lot of attention since the 1950s. Its streets are in terrible condition. It has really significant pedestrian issues. That's a person walking over a highway barrier to get to a park to walk to the grocery store. Prior to Hurricane Sandy, the housing was in really terrible shape. It had not been invested in. This is one of many majority-minority areas that had been redlined since the 1950s and hadn't received really any investment. And as a result, the housing was in not great shape and there were very few amenities. The whole of the community is in the floodplain. And it has this low shoreline which allows water to inundate the streets. And it also has this legacy of urban renewal. About half the property is vacant city-owned land, and a third in blue is housing that was built by New York City in the early 2000s in an attempt to sort of stabilize home ownership. This is what Edgemere looks like on a beautiful day in the Bay. It's also a lovely waterfront community. But I want to tell you about Sonia. So Sonia lived here, and on on a tour with HUD's regional administrator down this block to sort of show where the city is going to rebuild some housing. The housing administrator was like, City of New York, what are you doing? You can't just rebuild housing here. Like, everything else is a mess. And this was an important wake-up call for city officials because in looking at just Sonia's house, or missing house, we're not looking at all of the root causes of the challenges facing families like Sonia. And so rather than just continuing our build it back model of rebuild a house, move on, we said let's do two things. One, let's talk to Sonia and other homeowners like her in this area that has such weak infrastructure and see what they think their future is. Is it in Edgemere? Do they want to leave? What would they need to be able to stay here? And then let's talk to the neighborhood broadly and have a community planning process so we can sort of interrogate what would make Edgemere a better place, or what should Edgemere's future be. And so we had a almost 2-year planning process, which involved 22 agencies, city, state, and federal. And it really focused, it was a true planning process. The city did not go into it with an idealized outcome. And in terms of with the community broadly, we said, these are the risks your community faces. So the maps I showed you of like this, the neighborhood is in the floodplain. This is your risk from sea level rise. This is your actual topography. What would make it possible for you to live in Edgemere in 20 years? What would make it possible to be here in 2050? Do you see your children living in Edgemere? What makes that possible? And neighbors had interesting discussions with each other that were like, well, for me to live here, that house can't be there. That needs to be something. It needs to be a levee. It needs to be a park. And in speaking to homeowners like Sonia and her family were like, well, we want to live in Edgemere, but we don't want to live right where we live. We want to stay in our community, but not quite have as much risk. We don't need to be on the water, quite on the waterfront. So that raised the question, well, what do we do? So the community come up with this framework, which has a little bit of retreat, which is that area of purple where limiting coastal development was really important to the residents of Edgemere and also important to homeowners who lost their homes in Hurricane Sandy, who were in that area. They were like, we would move, but only if no one else can live here in the future, and only if we can stay within Edgemere. And because the city had vacant land, we could build a house within Edgemere. So we took this community planning framework and built out some pretty nice design scenarios of sort of looking at the shoreline, looking what it would take in the short, medium, and long term to reduce development, move towards more of moving away from the shoreline and creating a bit of an amenity space, but also providing some coastal protection to respond to the risk, providing opportunity to those homeowners who voluntarily wanted to move out of that area of highest risk and into other parts of Edgemere, and find ways to invest in the rest of the neighborhood through the creation of new affordable housing and improving the amenities that are there. So we coordinated with FEMA. We reallocated $67 million to create a raised shoreline, which also, looking at the park, which was in the eastern part of the neighborhood, improve the park amenities, but also use some nature-based solutions to sort of like mitigate tidal risk. We looked at ways to provide housing opportunity by elevating existing housing, particularly when you have attached homes like these. Sorry, the opacity was off. It's very difficult because you need both sides of the structure to agree to elevate, which just, like, seems very seems like natural, but when you have to actually talk with any two people and get them to agree to the same thing, is pretty complicated thing for government to do. We're not counselors, unfortunately. We built 2 new affordable housing buildings. So this is Beach Dunes Phase 2, which is a 107-unit all affordable building that opened 2 weeks ago, and is over the course of all of the Sandy recovery, the mayor changed. Mayor Bill de Blasio made affordable housing really the center of his platform. So it was important to him to show we could build affordable housing that could deal with climate risk. This is, at the time, it was the largest passive house structure in the nation. It's not anymore, but I hope we can build better passive houses, larger passive houses in New York. It has some other features I can tell you about if you're interested afterwards. But what we really tried to do in Edgemere is integrate all the aspects of the distress, not just the climate distress, but like all of these decades of challenging policy that made the community unable to deal with climate risk. So these were the street conditions before Hurricane Sandy. These are them in 2017 after rebuilding the roads. This is actually a small thing that I'm so proud of, which is that we cut through that highway barrier so you could walk into the park, which I think it's also, as designers, really important to keep in mind these details and how small measures can really make a huge difference. Now people can walk to their park without stepping over a barrier. They can walk to their grocery store. It's not rocket science, but it's like critically important to a quality of life. And so going back to Sonia and her house, we moved her about 5 blocks away. So this is where she was before. This is her house afterwards. And this is her hosting her daughter's wedding. And I think for me, Sonia's story and this community planning story are really important ways to understand the challenge of dealing with climate risk, because like what Edgemere shows is that it's possible to invest in communities and recognize climate risk, but not ignore that there's this history of policy of disinvestment. And this is actually pretty controversial because there are like very significant parts of the city administration and actually even the state where it was like a really big question. Why are you putting more money into this community that's just going to flood again? And it's already in bad shape. We shouldn't put money into it. We should find a way to move away from it. And in the context of New York City, where there's so many communities that receive so much investment, it's important to look at places that haven't received investment and imagine what they could be, and how to make places like Edgemere great places to live in the present and in what is the foreseeable future. Like, I don't know what Edgemere will look like in 2100 or 2150, but I know in 2050 it will still be a great place to be. And to me, that is success, because that's dealing with people who are there now and dealing with the real housing crisis that faces New York now, while recognizing that risks are changing and that we have to build in recognition of that risk. So I want to just briefly show a few examples of work I find inspiring in response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, which Puerto Rico has experienced very significant storm events as well as seismic events in the last several years, and faces particular challenges as an island nation, and has been not well treated by the United States. But in the face of this crisis, there have been some interesting responses. I really like Solar Libre, which is a nonprofit founded by the architect Rogers Marble and Walter Meyer, which figured out how to flat pack solar panels so they could be easily shipped to Puerto Rico and brought by boat to areas where the roads were in poor condition, so that in response to community needs that were most of the entire country lost power. So the question was, how do you bring power to places in a way that is efficient and can serve community needs. So they focused on community-centered power, so building solar systems on community centers, and working with community organizations to do job training so that people could have the skills to maintain the solar panels and not need the assistance of Solar Libre and maintain the network into the future. Another Puerto Rico initiative, which is a collaboration between enterprise community partners and MIT, is the Keep Safe Guide, which I think is a really important tool for designers, both if you're thinking of working in Puerto Rico or if you want to see, or other island communities faced by risk, or if you want to see how to break down very specific built conditions and built needs and very different climate challenges and the different tools you might have to employ and the different things you should consider in your design. So just as an example, how to build a sturdy roof that can withstand hurricane gale winds. It is, it shouldn't be very complicated. It's not very significant engineering, but when you try and apply techniques from other places in environments where they're not appropriate, you just get bad results. So coming back to New York and looking at this issue of sea level rise, how do we deal with this on the urban scale? How do we look at these social conditions and physical vulnerability? Sea level rise threatens to affect very significant parts of New York City, and as that floodplain expands with sea level rise, the infrastructure that supports our lives is at risk. So this is a sewer outfall. When in high tide conditions, this outfall will flood, and you'll get ocean water backing up into the street. This is extraordinarily disruptive. If you're trying to go to school, if you're trying to pick up the garbage, and this is happening now. And so this is a known. We live in places that face climate risk. We know that the global temperatures are changing and rising, and that weather is becoming less predictable. But the unknown is what we can do to adapt, and what else can change in our own capacity to deal with climate risk. And I think as designers, this is a really interesting place to work. So for me, I found an incredible moment of inspiration visiting Lyndon B. Johnson's ranch in Austin, Texas, or outside of Austin, Texas, because he has this amphicar, and that it's sort of a boat and it's sort of a car, and it's kind of mediocre at both. But this is in 1960, and he would drive it around the ranch and then pretend the brakes were failing. He would do this with like heads of state and drive it into a pond, and it would be a boat, and everyone would be amazed. But for me, I was just like, I had never thought about an amphibious car. Like, what an interesting way to try and deal with tidal flood risk and our street networks. And I'm not saying that amphibious cars are necessarily the solution to dealing with sea level rise at all. I don't actually really drive cars. My husband had to drive me here today, just to make it personal. But I think it's pretty provocative to think about like what's limiting our ability to deal with these challenges, and how can we be as creative as possible. And I think there are always alternative ways to deal with challenges. And what I think the important defining resilient moment for all of us to work together is how to use our collective creativity to try and solve these physical design problems, but consider the people who are at the center of them, and how we can use this creativity and harness this power to address social challenges of the past to create a more equitable future. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions, so about anything.
Were there
Sure, that's a great question. So after Hurricane Sandy, so New York City hadn't updated its floodplain regulations since, actually floodplain regulations were enacted in 1982, and the floodplain was actually quite out of date. So very significant parts of New York City that flooded were not considered in the floodplain, and the height that buildings would need to be built to. So I don't have a good illustration of this, but in the floodplain, you try and build above the floodplain, and then you add a foot or two of freeboard to try and, deal for the unpredictable. And so all of New York City's code was wrong, and its zoning was wrong. So first, the city passed an emergency zoning waiver to allow adoption of new flood maps or temporary flood maps, while the city continued to try and make permanent the new flood maps, which is like a 5-year process, 5 to 10-year process, if you're going to quibble with FEMA quite a bit. So that was the first thing, was like we have to make sure we can meet the minimum standards of elevation. But then the city had to look at all of its zoning and building code and said, well, how does this actually deal with risk, and how does it actually deal with our buildings? When you look at floodplain regulations, which are federally centered, it really looks at the problem as a house on a dune, and you just elevate that house. And what I've shown you today is New York City does have some single-family homes, but it has incredible complexity of buildings, all of which are old. So none of our buildings were built to any kind of flood standard. And what we saw is that building codes do work, so any building that was built after enacting of building code perform better than ones that predate code. So I think the things that are most interesting in our zoning really relate to multifamily housing, where you can't elevate in place as well without like losing significant amounts of space, or sometimes losing the base functionality. The space is like very constrained. So we tried to find different ways that you could like elevate mechanical systems and put them on rooftops or in side yards, if there are side yards. You had to waive a lot of regulations around like minimum lot size, minimum distance between buildings, like what is a utility structure versus actual zone structure. So there's kind of not a part of zoning that wasn't touched. We went through 2 flood text changes actually. So there was there was the emergency waiver, then there was a set of flood text that was passed. Zoning goes through a public approval process, and it went through a non-public approval process, so it could go into effect sooner. And then when we started to use the zoning in housing recovery, we saw all these places where it didn't work. And where it actually didn't work is with single-family homes, because the single-family homes that were destroyed by Hurricane Sandy were all previously non-conforming or non-complying, and the regulation only allowed recreation of the exact non-compliance, which if you're trying to build better quality housing, you actually like don't want to do that. You probably want to build a better structure, and like whatever cobbled together structure that was there, or winterized bungalow that maybe didn't have ADA accessibility, or strange additions or enclosed porches, like you want to have a new structure that's better than what you had before. So we passed a second set of zoning, which did go through a public process, and ended up being pretty controversial, because in certain communities, particularly on Staten Island, where they're trying to create more of an upper class suburban atmosphere, they really didn't want to see the recreation of these small bungalows, because the small bungalows to them meant low income people. So it became like a pretty interesting class fight. But was just zoning, Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Your talk is great. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about the need to balance a sense of urgency, whether it be to rehome a family or a neighborhood,
It's really challenging. I mean, I think what made my role so interesting was that I got to know homeowners and real people. I got to think about their challenges and what it meant on sort of a programmatic level, like how do you operate efficiently, and then what does this mean for city policy. I think for this particular disaster, New York City had pretty significant resources. The federal government gave it a lot of money. So people, for the most part, were somewhat housed. So I wasn't in the part of emergency response that was like, how do you house people? Which is extraordinarily challenging work. What you want to balance is putting all of this effort and significant amount of resources into only recreating the problem it's not a good solution. So you want to try and find a way to come up with something that captures at least the middle ground of a better solution and some sense of fairness. And I think fairness is a really interesting question in this context because like federal policy around the funding we were using like defines in a very particular way, which is actually not that fair. It's fair in that I can't treat a black or a white applicant differently, and it's fair in that I'm not supposed to look at any structure differently. So a house is a house is a house. But that's actually very unfair if you're looking at like what a house was before that was very, very distressed and had lots of other problems, and a house that had fewer needs. And they both may need to be elevated, for instance, if they don't need to be totally reconstructed, but they have very different problems, and you might want to come to a different solution. And so that's where it gets trickier, and then it's much more challenging when you're like, how can we start to integrate infrastructure planning and sort of these long-term capital frameworks where like I really breeze through those projects, but some of those are 15-year projects. You know, some of them are underway. Like I showed you 200-unit buildings that are done. But it takes an incredible amount of both coordination and passion and diplomacy for people to like professionally work together to try and like work through both the human challenges and keeping New Yorkers at the center, but also just like regulation and like design. Like it's a lot of different languages altogether. You had a question?
This is really a small detail. On one of the reconstructions of streets, you mentioned that the road was now cupped instead of cambered.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that in a few various places. Can you speak at all to just the situations where that makes sense?
I can try. Let me just bring it up for you. There it is. Okay. So New York City, I'm not a civil engineer. I don't work in the Department of Environment. Did not work in the Department of Environmental Protection, although I got to know the Bureau of Water and Sewer staff pretty well. New York City has a very old sewer system. It's a gravity sewer system. New York City does not do any pumping, so what that means is sewage leaves your house and by gravity goes to a treatment center. Parts of the city have a combined sewer, which means the stormwater and human waste mix and sometimes run off into the waterways. The city is slowly moving away from that, and there are other separated sewers. Almost all of the city has the classic crown versus the inverted crown, because you want the water, if you have like storm, depending on where your street infrastructure is, like, New York's very old, so it embeds a lot of the infrastructure in relation to the sidewalk and in relation to the building. So the storm sewer and the grading in relation to draining the sidewalk and draining the street are really focused at that periphery. When you can totally reconstruct a street and you don't have like heavy vehicles and heavy traffic, you can invert the crown to have the drainage at the center. I think it's something the city should do more. I've definitely noticed it. I really didn't know anything about sewers until I took this job, and now like wherever we go, I'm like, where's the stormwater going? Like how's this street work? And it's super interesting if you like walk around like old medieval centers in European cities, and you're like, oh well, they solved this in like very interesting ways. And in some ways, like a lot of the hardening of infrastructure in like the second half of the 20th century is so artificial. But the other problem with the inverted crown is you need the drainage capacity beneath it. So when you're driving through, the water is going to the center, so it's going into the driving lane. So you need the capacity to drain the street. Whereas if the stormwater is running off the street to the two sides, you're driving, not through the water. So I think another reason why it's really interesting as someone who's not very automobile focused is you can use the inverted crown in places that are much more pedestrian friendly or lower traffic, and it can be sort of like a fundamental rethinking of streetscape. But if you're really vehicularly centered, or you're in an area where you have like lots of goods moving through trucks, it's not going to work. Or it's going to be really frustrating if you're in the car and your car's not amphibious. If your car's amphibious, that's probably what you want. So,
thank you very much.
Yeah.